We got Julius Caesar killed, last time on Monday. So then, after him, there was a civil war in which Cleopatra left Rome and joined up with Mark Antony, believing Mark Antony would win. But Mark Antony didn't win. And Cleopatra and Mark Antony both committed suicide. All right, I want to mention the Julian calendar. For about 500 years, the Western world used the Julian calendar. We quit using it owing to the fact that it was off. What do we mean off? Any calendar has to keep the solstices and the equinoxes occurring at approximately the same date, or you're going to find yourself celebrating Christmas when the temperature outside is 90 to 95 degrees, and you'll be having temperatures of below zero in the month of June. What about the solstices? You know, the summer solstice occurs on June 21st, or approximately. The winter solstice occurs on December 21st. The equinoxes occur March and September. Now, due to a wobble in the Earth's orbit, for the next 80 years at least, the fall equinox will not occur on September 21st. It will occur on September 22nd, maybe even September 21st. Now, eventually it'll be back to September, maybe even September 23rd. Eventually it'll be back to September 21st again. Anyway, the Julian calendar was set up by Julius Caesar, who dabbled in astronomy, but they did not have accurate enough records to realize that it was wrong. Now, 500 years later, a pope named Pope Gregory the Great changed the calendar to the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar has been going up, we've had it for 1,500 years. It is expected to last 10,000 years before we're going to have to add a date or subtract a date, somewhere up and down the road. Anyway, hopefully that explains why we have leap years. Leap years occur because if we didn't, the solstices and equinoxes would get all out of whack. You may or may not know, the year 2000 was a leap year. You might say, isn't it? No. The years at the end of the century are usually not leap years. The year 1600 was, 1700, 1800, 1900 were not. No. If the year is divisible by 400, it's a leap year. If it isn't, it's not a leap year. I'm talking about the years at the end of the century, the zero years. 1800 was not a leap year, 1700 was not a leap year, but 1600 was. 1200 was a leap year. 800 was a leap year. 800, 1200, 1600, and 2000. Those years at the end of the century were leap years. The years between were not. All right, now when Caesar Augustus came along, he was the next one after Julius. He made a little bit of a change in the calendar. He named a month after, Julius named a month after himself, the month of July. Caesar Augustus named a month after himself, the month of August. And he wanted to make sure it was almost as hot as the month of July. You know, July was Julius he picked out as the hottest month on the calendar. Caesar Augustus wanted to pick a month that was about equally as hot. And to make sure it had 31 days and was as long as the month of July, he stole a day from the month of February. Because February was considered unlucky, so he figured the less bad luck we had, the better his empire would be. So he stole a day from the month of February. But every fourth year we have to add a day to the calendar, so we add it to February. I don't know if I've had teachers who did not know all this stuff about the calendar. But, anyway, this is the story of the calendar as we have it. I'll be mentioning the calendar again when we come to Pope Gregory the Great late in the semester. Now, to protect himself, Caesar Augustus set up the Praetorian Guard. You can compare the Praetorian Guard to the Secret Service. The Praetorian Guard would follow him around, and they would even come to the Senate chamber with their swords and armor to make sure that there was no assassination thought on him. He tried to maintain a symbol. He realized that the people that killed Julius Caesar killed Julius because they wanted to restore the old republic. So he tried to make it seem like he was part of the Republic. When it came time to sit in the Senate, he would not sit at the head. He would sit there among the senators as one of them. But he claimed that he was merely princeps, or first among equals. From that word princeps, we get the word prince. However, he actually ruled like a dictator, even though he tried to make it look like he was ruling according to the Roman Constitution. He was popular, his rule was peaceful, and by the time he died after a reign of 45 years, nobody, remember, keep in mind, life generally was shorter in those days than it is now. And give 9 years for Julius Caesar, 45 and 9, 54 years. By the time that Caesar Augustus died, nobody could remember what life was like in the Republic. The people in Europe started looking to Rome to solve their problems, and this trend was to continue for the next 1,500 years. Even after the Caesars ceased to be, the popes took over. And the popes tried to run Europe, and in some cases actually did run Europe, for many a generation, until finally in the early 1500s, the power of the popes was lessened. But Rome was the center of European religious and intellectual life for 1,500 years after Julius Caesar took over. Caesar Augustus reorganized the army. He recruited mostly from Italians. Now this is going to become a hot issue because the time was to come when Italians did not want to serve. I'll get into that before the lesson's over, but Italians didn't want to serve, so the later emperors had to recruit from non-Italians, and eventually they even recruited from people who were not even part of the Roman Empire. They started paying soldiers from Germany and from other places who were hired soldiers and mostly foreigners. It would be like our country recruiting an army from Mexico, from Brazil, and from Canada, and even maybe from Russia. I mean, we don't do that, but it'd be similar. He did have one war, which was a disaster. He sent an army in to try to conquer Germany. The army was completely annihilated. He was seen going around his palace, banging his head, maybe his hands against the wall, saying, "Give me back my army. Oh, please give me back my army." Did him no good. The army didn't come back. So he made a law that Rome was never to go to war with Germany again. 100 years later, Rome did go to war with Germany and conquered Germany. At least conquered part of it. A later emperor. He tried to restore the old standards of morality. They call it traditional morality. Folks, there's a whole lot that these people experienced that we're experiencing in the year 2018. A lot of people still believe in traditional morality. He tried. Here's what he saw in Rome. He saw the Roman people engaging in parties that would last all night long, with a whole lot of gluttony and heavy drinking going on. And the way this might sound sickening, but I think it needs to be said. The way these people would party, they would fill their stomachs up and then go to a latrine, regurgitate it all out, go back and party some more. Now this greatly shortened their lives, but he felt like it was wrong. Other people began to believe it was wrong also. So he tried to limit the amount of money that could be spent on a party. In fact, he did. His laws were enforced. He also outlawed adultery, even though that had little effect, but at least he tried. Herpes was a problem. Herpes is, even they at the time knew how it was spread. And he tried to encourage people to marry one person and stay married, and thereby avoid herpes. Stay faithful. I mean, stay married, stay faithful. He taxed persons who did not marry. Now, again, we do the same thing. I mean, I was single, I was 39, and I paid a higher tax rate, higher percentage, than I did after I married and had 3 children. Couples who had less than 3 children, he taxed heavily. These laws were carried out, but they had little effect. The fact is, there was a decline in morality that was to continue all the way to the end of the empire. Now, he did have one big problem. He made a move that was eventually to help lead to the end of the empire. He gave his people bread and circuses. In other words, give them food and entertainment. Keep the poor people fed and keep them entertained. And there, number one, there becomes mind-numbed zombies. But they became utterly useless, worthless citizens. They felt that way about themselves. Some people felt that way about them. They lived in the poor section of town. And you could tell the poverty section. And nobody knew when they were going to burst out from the poor section of town and start rioting. And riots were very frequent. And the Roman government did not really take a decisive stand against the rioters. All right. For instance, to try to enforce traditional morality, he had a person who wrote pornographic literature exiled one time. Again, all this did very little good. He tried to discourage divorce, all of which the laws had little effect, but even though they were carried out. Now, when he passed off the scene, he had adopted a son, just like he was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. He had adopted a son named Tiberius. For all practical purposes, Tiberius taking over established dynastic rule. Even though Tiberius was not a blood relative of Julius, of Caesar Augustus, he was adopted. Now this is something that the Roman emperors were to do, for a lot of them, for generations. They would bypass their own biological sons to be the emperor, and instead appoint the most promising looking young man they could find. This had two effects. Number one, it made it look like they were not setting up dynastic rule, which the people of Rome were really hard against. In other words, they didn't want the monarchy to be restored. So, and also it propagated the myth that the emperors were appointed. In other words, the emperors would say, "Oh, we're not hereditary; we've been appointed." So the emperors would claim to be appointed, just like the old leaders had, when actually, for all practical purposes, they were picked by the former emperor. Now, so a little side note, and I'll be talking more about this when the lesson goes on. Caesar Augustus was a Caesar when Jesus was born, but during the 3 years of Christ's public ministry, Tiberius, Jesus, that was Jesus' public ministry during the reign of Tiberius. The old history books will say that Tiberius likely knew nothing about Jesus, but the last time I read about it, there are persons now who believe that Tiberius might have known about what was going on in Judea and might have been watching the events, which might help explain why Pontius Pilate was so terrified when they brought him to him and demanded that Jesus be crucified, because he knew he would have to ultimately give an answer to Tiberius why he had done that. Now, Tiberius got a bad press owing to a historian named Tacitus. Tacitus did not like him. Tiberius is known to have been very unpopular in Rome. He survived several assassination plots, but he was highly popular out in the provinces. The people who did not know him seemed to like him. The people who knew him closely didn't. But again, I'll have more to say about Tacitus also later. Tacitus gave him a bad press, pictured as being a suspicious old man, fearful of assassination attempts. Well, like I say, there were several assassination attempts on him while he was alive. He did not have the charisma that Caesar Augustus had. Now, this is a survey course. I took a course in Rome when I was in graduate school, and we spent a whole quarter, like we were on the quarter system, we spent a whole quarter talking about Roman history. And we went through all these emperors in much more detail, but I'm going to, not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to mention one more emperor in this dynasty, Nero. Now this dynasty is sometimes called the Julio-Claudian dynasty because we began with Julius and ended with an emperor named Claudius. But one of the emperors of this period was Nero. Before Hitler, before Saddam Hussein, before Stalin, Nero was an example of the worst kind of leader a person could have. Nero did not ever believe he'd be emperor. You know, he was a member of the royal family. He grew up in a palace. He was related to the emperor, but there were several people ahead of him. But all the persons who were ahead of him died off. You know, even the plagues and diseases even hit the upper classes. And when the emperor died, all of a sudden he was told, "Hey, you're the next emperor." Really? I don't. Yeah, you've got a duty to perform. It's your duty. He actually had taken up art, and he was a musician, an artist. He believed himself to be a really, really good artist, but he was called on to be emperor. Well, the emperors have to do things that he had never done before. Shortly after he took office, there was a plot found against him. The plot was foiled. But because the plot involved some nobility, only the emperor could sign the execution order for them. So they brought the paperwork to Nero and said, "Your Majesty, sign here." And he said, "You mean if I sign this, somebody's going to die?" "Yes, Your Majesty, you're emperor now. This is what you have to do. This is part of your job." And Nero was aghast. "I wish I'd never learned to write." And he signed. Well, the second time he signed, he wasn't quite so hesitant about it. He eventually got to a place where he could sign execution orders without any twang of conscience. Just became second nature to him. Easy about it. Now, a big fire occurred in Rome. We don't know. There's two stories about what Nero did. In one story, he was outside of Rome when he heard about the fire and came in and tried to direct the operation putting it out after all he was emperor. But the other story was that he was fiddling away, fiddling on his fiddle while Rome burned. Again, it's hard to tell after 2,000 years. I mean, it's hard enough to tell something that happened 35 or 40 years ago. But, nevertheless, after 2,000 years, it's really hard to tell. Whatever, the people of Rome blamed the fire on him. At this point, he became desperate. There was a new group of people who were starting to rise up, and it became increasing in numbers, particularly in Rome. I'm talking about the Christians. Nero blamed the fire on the Christians and began a program to eradicate Christianity. And for the next 250 years, from 64 CE until 312 CE, persecution of Christians by emperors was on again, off again. Not every emperor persecuted, but some did, but Christians would get maybe a generation or two of respite, then would come an emperor who would try to eradicate them. The attempt was to eradicate all Christianity and stop the movement entirely. As I think every one of us know, those attempts failed. But Nero was the first one. He tried to eradicate Christianity. St. Peter and St. Paul are believed to have both been in Rome at the time. Paul was a citizen. He could not be crucified, so he was beheaded. Peter was not a citizen, like Jesus had not been a citizen either. So Peter was crucified. Again, this is tradition. Paul was beheaded. Both of them killed on the orders of Nero. Well, someone made a prophecy at the time that the time would come when men would name their sons Paul and name their dogs Nero.